It's nice to meet you today. We are in the third parallel session on Make the Right Real, Right to Move. It is time to make it. The PyeongChang Disability Forum is being held under the theme of Leave No One Behind and Colorwood Paralympic Movement. And we have a sub-theme for this parallel session 3, which is on the right to mobility. And in the interest of time, I will be very brief with the introductions. First of all, on this session, there are basic conditions for complete social participation of the disabled, one of which is the right to mobility. Article 9 of the UNCRPD stipulates this, and there is the right to accessibility that is stipulated here. It's 20 years anniversary of the disability rights movement here in Korea, so we are at a very important juncture for this parallel session discussion. We have two speakers from overseas on the ADA, American Disability Act, accessibility of transportation in the ADA. On this topic, we will have the first presentation, and then there will be examples and other presentations on improved accessibility of transportation by the ADA by the second speaker. So it will be better for me to introduce the speaker right before the presentation. First, on accessibility of transportation in the ADA, we have Professor Lex Frieden, who is connected directly online. And our two overseas speakers are connected from overseas, and so we will go right away to listen to Professor Lex Frieden's presentation first. He's a physical medicine and rehabilitation professor at the University of Texas Health Science Center. So let's listen to the presentation by Professor Frieden.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for your warm welcome. I give you greetings from my colleagues in Houston, Texas. Today I have the opportunity to speak with you about one important aspect of the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA of 1990. The disability movement in the U.S. began to accelerate in the 1970s. And we had organizations of people with disabilities in communities, and eventually we had national and regional organizations of people with disabilities. But the people in each community acted independently in many regards and addressed the barriers to their full access, full participation, and community living through local action. And I want to talk about that, and I have some videos to share with you today in order to do that. Can we go to the next slide, please? So in the beginning, as we organized, we asked questions of our mayor, of our city councilors, of our political leaders, and our elected officials. And the questions are people with disabilities a part of the public? Are we citizens like everyone else? And of course, their answer was yes, yes. You are citizens, you are part of the public, you are residents of the community. Of course, you are part of the public. You may do as people in the public do. So we asked them, do we have public transportation? Is that transportation provided by the community? And their answer was yes, we have public transportation. And then those of us who used wheelchairs asked the question, if we are part of the public and the transportation is for the public, then why are we not able to use it? And this led to activism. It led to civil unrest, or sometimes we call it civil disobedience. Many of us protested by sitting in our wheelchairs in the lane in front of the bus. So the bus could not pass because we were there in our wheelchairs. Other people took chains and connected themselves to the buses. Next slide, please.
It began with the Vietnam veterans, the wounded among them, who refused to disappear into hospitals and nursing homes. They felt that their country owed them normal lives. They spearheaded what was to become a new movement. The new militants are the disabled citizens of America, demonstrating as best they can. Unhearing, but speaking out, sometimes with difficulty.
Who hurts most with inflation? Who? Widows. We earn less than other people in the United States. We have less opportunity to work, less flexibility.
The blind, too, are looking for a better future. Blind people gather to protest Federal Aviation Administration rules that say their canes must be taken from them at takeoff and landing, rules that only one airline is observing.
But the message they get today is clear. We will set the pace and we'll set the standards for our lives, not the FAA, not the federal government, nor United. We are American citizens and we shall be free. Yeah.
So you can see that the activism by people with disabilities got attention of the public, of the news media. And we continued to ask the question, when will the transportation be accessible to us? As members of the public, as citizens, when will we be able to use the goods and services provided for the public? Can you click on the next one, please? So you can see that we got the attention of the press, the media. We wrote articles for newspapers, opinion pieces, and the newspaper news people covered our story, and the television news covered our story. And see, we proceeded with our activism for year after year after year. And each year, the public officials would make promises to us. Oh yes, we will purchase new vehicles with ramps or with lifts. We will be sure that you can use the public services. And the same thing happened with buildings that had steps. Of course, the people who were using the buildings said, well, everyone should be able to use the building. There should be signs so that blind people will be able to use the building. Signs in Braille. There should be directions for people who use wheelchairs about the ramps, if there might be one in the back or somewhere else. They always promised to do things and then they didn't. So we continued our efforts. Next slide, please.
Disabled Metro riders will have some new wheels very soon after a big victory yesterday in a Metro board meeting. As expected, the Transit Authority Board voted to equip all new buses with wheelchair lifts. Debbie Johnson has the story.
Metro board members did an about-face when they unanimously agreed to equip all new buses with wheelchair lifts. The federal courts ruled recently that municipalities are not required to provide such a service, but an act pending before Congress that will establish accessible transit to all riders has encouraged Metro to change directions.
I think at the heart of this decision was a notion that as I said in the board meeting, that what this country really is about is the ability of all citizens to participate equally. The government's role is to give each of our citizens a chance to make that contribution of which he or she is capable. It's a small thing, but it's what help we can give to these people, and they're good folks, to make whatever contribution they're capable of, and I feel just as good as she does about it.
She is Lori Gherkin, Vice President of the Coalition for Barrier-Free Living. At Metro's board meeting, they announced they were dropping their lawsuit against Metro in light of the lifts being installed.
We believe Metro's decision is an important step in the continuing effort to remove discrimination and create equal access for people with disabilities in all areas of life. Many people who have lacked access to adequate transportation will now have the opportunity to be more productive and less dependent on public support.
This decision of the Metro Board and with Mr. Lanier's support is going to open vast new vistas for people with disabilities.
Handicapped riders will meet with Metro officials Friday morning to begin working on plans to implement the new wheelchair-equipped buses. Metro officials say they expect to have them in service by the end of the year. Debbie Johnson, 13 Eyewitness News.
So you can see that the ADA was born from efforts by advocates that extended over more than a decade. We worked together on issues like transportation. We worked on issues like housing, public access to buildings. We worked on issues like captioning for people who were deaf or hearing impaired. We worked on many issues together, and part of the key to the advocacy that worked for the ADA was the fact that all disability groups were collaborating. We were working with one another. If deaf people had issues that they believe should be addressed, then people with all other disabilities joined them. The issues were not only for deaf people, the issues were for all of us. We shared the feeling of discrimination. I can tell you myself, when I applied to go to university in 1968, and the university told me, you are using a wheelchair, and we will not admit students with disabilities to our school. This made me an advocate. It's made me think. It made me understand that advocacy for people with disabilities and the rights of people with disabilities are not unlike the advocacy that we had taken in our country and the rights that we had worked on for people of color and for women and for other groups that had been ignored in the past or who had not been able to express themselves fully as citizens. So what has the ADA actually done for us? If we look at survey data from people with disabilities across the United States, one of the most significant impacts of the ADA has been on public transportation. On the day that the ADA was signed by President George H.W. Bush, on that day, every transit agency in the United States was told that they must provide, that it was the right for people with disabilities to have accessible public transportation. Overnight, policies were changed in every city and every town. And the same action applied for many other kinds of accommodations that people with disabilities need. The ADA was a very strong law. It changed a lot for us in America, and I think it had an impact on the CRPD. I did have the opportunity, representing the United States, to propose on the behalf of the United States to have an international convention, which we now call the CRPD. Unfortunately, the United States has yet to ratify that provision. And we have been working as advocates now for, again, decades to get our government to ratify the CRPD. So advocacy does not end with one victory. You have to continue for a lifetime and lifetimes beyond your own to achieve equal opportunity and equal rights. I'm glad to be here today. Thank you for the time. I look forward to the questions and answers.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you so much.
렉스 프라이덴 교수님
Professor Lex Frieden has given an excellent presentation, and my understanding is that the situation in the US prior to the ADA was that the disabled people encounter a lot of difficulty in terms of accessibility to transportation. And he shared some background information about the history of the enactment of ADA, the Vietnamese War veterans coming together to protest, to ask important questions to the public officials. And since 1988, there was a mandate to request all new public buses to have wheelchair loading be possible. And there were a lot of activism that caught the attention of the media. And so all of the new buses, public buses, were required to be wheelchair able. And in the 1990, George H.W. Bush signed the ADA, and there was stipulation about accessibility of transportation for the disabled in the ADA. And he pointed out something very important at the last part. He shared his personal experience trying to go into a university, and over his lifetime, he has worked for accessibility of transportation and many other advocacy for the disabled. And he emphasized that this is a lifelong process and effort. And it was a very compact presentation, so we really appreciate his presentation. Thank you.
Let us now move on to an example of improved accessibility of transportation by the ADA. We have Mr. John Wadach, former chief of the Disability Rights Section, Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. Your presentation, please.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here with you, and always delighted to be with Lex Frieden, who is an American hero in the disability rights movement in the United States. I'm going to continue from Lex and talk about public transportation and why it's a right. As we heard before, the basis for this internationally is the CRPD, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And there are several titles that refer to this. Basically, the principles behind the CRPD, as I hope you all know, are non-discrimination and accessibility. It's important to remember that non-discrimination includes the concept of reasonable accommodation. So non-discrimination may include taking positive steps to ensure that there are adjustments or modifications that allow people with disabilities to participate equally in society. And the important title here is Article 9, which talks about accessibility to roads, buildings, and transportation. So we start from there. But I like to think about the principles of why it is so important. And there's a need for a comprehensive approach. So why is that? Because transportation is the key. If you want to ensure that people have access to jobs, that they can get to their job, that there's transportation, that they can have a job. There's transportation so that they can enjoy the activities of daily living, getting to a restaurant, getting to meet with a friend, getting to a doctor's appointment. All of these things require that transportation be accessible, affordable, available, and that it be comprehensive. It's also important when you think about transportation that there's a strong role for the central government. One role is establishing standards for what's an accessible building, for who are people with disabilities, for what's an accessible vehicle. There's also the role of providing strong enforcement. In my view, that includes receiving complaints from people with disabilities, investigating them, and taking action when there are deficiencies and the law is not being followed. And access to the courts to ensure that change can come about from the law. In the United States, and I think in any country, there has to be funding for accessible transportation. For example, in the United States, the federal government for city buses pays 80% of the cost of city buses around the United States. Another part that I think is important is public outreach, so that people with disabilities know what their rights are, and so that businesses or governments or covered entities know what their responsibilities are and can find ways to comply with the law and find out what works and what doesn't. And finally, I think the role of the central government is ensuring an active, independent role for people with disabilities. The notion of nothing about us without us is very important in this, and people with disabilities should be able to enforce the law independently of whatever the federal government or any other government officials do. Now, our approach in the U.S. came about through the Americans with Disabilities Act. I think there are a couple key points to remember, and that the first is that all forms of transportation are covered, and they have to be covered. We're here talking about public transportation today, but it also includes private transportation. So for us, the ADA applies to bus routes in the city. It applies to buses that go between city, intercity buses is what we call them. It includes all forms of rail, rapid rail, light rail, commuter rail. It includes taxis, shuttles, and don't forget water transportation, ferries. For private enterprises that provide transportation under our ADA are also covered, and they have to ensure that what they provide is accessible. And when we talk about what's accessible, we mean the whole range. Starting with the buildings, people usually think about that, but then you have to get to vehicle design, and the ADA itself sets up standards that our federal agencies have put. So what's an accessible vehicle? What makes a bus accessible? What makes a train accessible? And then also policies for accommodating persons with disabilities. It's a very important part. When I mentioned reasonable accommodation before, is you have to have policies, whether you're talking about a bus driver who not only is courteous to people with disabilities, but knows how to ensure that they can travel safely on the bus. Effective communication is part of this, so that people who are blind or have low vision, people who are deaf or hard of hearing, people with intellectual disabilities can understand any information that is being given. It can be simple, it can be more difficult. It can be a system on a bus that calls out stops or that provides the information electronically, but it also can be a bus driver making sure that they announce every bus stop and where they are. In the US, we also talk a lot about service animals. They are obviously must be able to go freely on public transportation. And in recent years, people tend to think of service animals are dogs for people who are blind. But in the recent years, there has been an expansive use of service animals in the United States. People who are deaf have hearing dogs. People with seizure disorders have seizure alert animals. People with a range of psychosocial conditions. Think of, in the US, we've had a lot of soldiers returning from the wars that we have been involved in the recent years with post-traumatic stress disabilities. And many of them use service animals to deal with their disabilities. Ensuring that they are on transportation is very important. And the last issue that I want to mention, and it's a key one now, is accessible websites. How people make reservations, how they know information is using websites and making sure that those websites are accessible to the whole range of people with disabilities. This is a little more on the US approach. I think one of the standards of the ADA is a very stringent standard for anything new. If you're going to buy a new bus, it must be accessible. If you're building a new building, it must be accessible fully under standards that are initiated. Now, everyone recognizes there are costs here, but the way you deal with those costs is not weakening the standards, it's giving people more time. So for example, I'm talking about Amtrak, which is intercity buses in a minute, and a settlement agreement. The ADA itself gave Amtrak, which is the intercity bus company in the United States, until 20 years in order to be fully accessible. It was a recognition that there would be difficulties in doing that. So that is an important part of the ADA. I've mentioned most of these: the strong federal role, the funding by the federal government, and giving people with disabilities and organizations that represent them the ability to represent themselves and people with disabilities and enforce the law. Okay, I'm going to talk about two cases that were settled. One just happened recently, December in 2020. It's a settlement agreement between Amtrak and the United States Department of Justice. Now, Amtrak is also known as the National Railroad Passenger Corporation. It is the entity in the United States that runs trains that go around the country. There are over 500 railroad stations in 46 states. The ADA gave them until 2010 to be accessible. After 2010, the Department of Justice started getting complaints from people with disabilities saying, the train stations we can't travel, we are having difficulty. The Department of Justice investigated, and in June of 2015, put out a very lengthy letter of findings of the problems. And what they found was that the overwhelming majority of rail stations in the United States were inaccessible. Now, you may think of rail stations when you think of, like, if you've been to New York City or San Francisco, these very large stations, many of those were accessible. But remember, we're talking about 500 stations in rural areas and maybe even small towns. You didn't have accessibility of the rail station. So people with disabilities really did not have full access to rail transportation between cities. So the settlement agreement is very detailed. If you want to see it yourself, you can go to a federal website, ada.gov. There's a slide that mentions it later, and you can read it yourself. You can also read the letter of findings. it's very complete. And if this gives you an example, this slide gives you an example of the areas where they found the violations. They found violations in parking. They found violations in the route from the parking lot to the buildings. They found problems with the building entrances. They found problems in the waiting areas, the sitting rooms in the buildings. They found problems with elevators, with toilet rooms, with signage. They also found difficulties in some stations for getting from the building to the platform, and sometimes in the platforms and the track crossings. Now, not every one of these stations had every one of these problems. And so you can see that the investigation was very detailed, very complete, because they came up with what were the violations in each of these stations and came up with a plan that Amtrak had to do. One of the things that the plan requires is that in the future, any new building, any new station, any new vehicle, they all have to be accessible. And they also have to, it's usually a very complex relationship. You don't just have Amtrak, they have relationships. There are stores in in a train station. There are many facilities. They're operated not by Amtrak, but they have a contract with them. And so what this agreement ensures is that, if there's a Starbucks, ensuring that Starbucks is fully accessible, ensuring that if there's a deli, anything that's in the station has to be accessible, and there's an agreement that Amtrak has to have to ensure that works. The agreement itself specifically called out 135 inaccessible stations and said within the next 10 years, they had to be all made fully accessible, giving priority to the stations that had the biggest problems, the most severe problems, as well as stations with the highest ridership. One of the significant parts of this agreement, though, was recognizing that people with disabilities had been denied access over a period of years. And this agreement set up a fund of $2.25 million that's available to compensate people with disabilities who, since 2013, have been denied access to our rail system. And there's a very elaborate system set up that people can come forward and make their claim. In addition, the agreement, as all of these agreements have a robust training for staff, because the training has to be continuous, because we have people who turn over. So you may train your staff in 1 year, but some of those people aren't in the positions anymore. And these people have to know what the requirements of the agreement are and how to deal with people with disabilities. And they also had to set up a process to receive, investigate, and address any complaints. And there are very strong reporting requirements to the Department of Justice. So this is a very large agreement. It covers a huge part of the United States and will bring about a lot of change in the United States. I wanted to talk about, in the time we have left, one other agreement. It's a little older, but I like this agreement because it points out how the government and people with disabilities and their organizations can work together. It involves the bus system in the city of Jackson, Mississippi. And at the time this was done, I was the head of the office that did this. So this was one of the ones that I was involved in personally. It involved Jackson's town in Mississippi. There was a lawsuit that was going on brought by a disability rights organization, Disability Rights Mississippi, representing the Mississippi Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities and also the Mississippi Council for the Blind. But as is always the case, the disability groups and organizations don't always have the resources and the funding to do a strong job when you're dealing with the difficulties of litigation. And also, and having the federal government come and join with the groups can really provide a great deal of support for the litigation. So we joined this litigation. The issues here were, and this was back in time, this was in 2010, failure to keep the lifts in operating conditions on city buses. And then when they weren't functioning, not providing alternative transportation to people who needed the lifts. There was also a problem with training staff because they didn't keep the equipment in excess of the equipment in workable fashion. And there was a lot of difficulty with what we would say is a lack of courtesy and respect for people with disabilities by bus drivers. And there was also, we haven't talked much about complementary paratransit. It's what's required in the ADA for any city that operates a bus. They have to have what we call complementary paratransit for people who, because of the severity of their disability, aren't able, even with an attendant or with assistance, to use city buses. The city must have a system of transportation that provides rides for people with disabilities, and they weren't doing that in the city. So we entered into an agreement. There was a lot of relief. They agreed that they would operate accessible lifts on all city buses. If they found one that was inoperable, they would remove it immediately. The key here was getting a program of preventative maintenance, including training for staff and daily records, really changing the way that the bus system operated so that they put accessibility at the top of the line. It included a lot of training, including training bus operators on appropriate conduct, including assisting wheelchair users, not bypassing wheelchair users when they saw them on a stop, which was one of the allegations. And also when you had construction or other issues, moving the bus and stopping it so a wheelchair user could board, even if it wasn't the regular bus stop. And as in all of the agreements that the Department of Justice did, and there was a set of procedural requirements, a lot of them very important, appointing an ADA coordinator, training staff, having a effective complaint procedure, and conducting public outreach so that the public knew of the changes. And one of the things that they had to really do in Jackson, because people with disabilities had become discouraged in terms of using the bus service. So there was a great deal of outreach to reach out to the community and say, we are going to serve you now. The buses are going to be accessible. So those are two examples out of many in terms of how we get to the point of having accessible public transportation in the United States. You can see it's not always easy. As Lex said, it's something you have to keep working on. The government has to keep working on. We all advocates have to keep working on. Accessibility is very important, but we all have to work to ensure that it's there. So, as I said, you can find these agreements on ada.gov. If you're looking for other information about transportation in the United States, there are a couple of other websites that are important. The Department of Transportation has a website called, and it's right here, transit.dot.gov. And if you go to the Civil Rights ADA tab, there's a wealth of information of the nitty-gritty of how you make buses accessible, how you make rail accessible. And the last resource, a fabulous resource in the United States, the ADA National Network, and their website is adata.org. So I look forward, I thank you for your time, and I look forward to the questions that you may have. Thanks.
네, 존 워라츠 국장님.
Yes, Mr. John Warach, thank you very much for your presentation.
방금 국장님께서 오늘 발제를 해주신 내용들이
Mr.
좀 전에
Warach
발표한 내용보다
has given us specific examples with regard to accessibility. We've heard examples of how accessibility can be promoted. And he mentioned that it has to be a very closely knitted system to raise accessibility, and that it's all elaborated in ADA. And also action plans are in place, and the federal government and various organizations and the advocacy are involved in the efforts. And you've also talked about the comprehensive approach of enabling people to go to work, to move around, and in that aspect, transportation is critical. For those that are employed, they need to be mobile. They need to be able to go from one place to another. So it's about making sure that accessibility is provided across the board.
그다음에 이제
So
편의제공 서비스에
thank you
대한
very much for
문제를
that. And you
강의를
also
했다.
talked about reasonable accommodation.
이동에 대한
And when we say
제공도
reasonable accommodation, it includes mobility, but it also has to do with moving from a building. It also has to do with moving from one place to another, the routes, the connecting routes.
동물
And we've also mentioned that in the ADA agreement, it also has to do with service animals that would be an important part of supporting persons with disabilities. And not only that, you've mentioned that it also includes various aspects of disabilities about the support that can be offered to different types of persons with disabilities.
지금 말씀해 주신 내용이 굉장히 많은데요.
There was a lot of ground covered, and especially you've mentioned about the example of Amtrak.
촘촘한
The fact that
접근 가능성을
accessibility was investigated throughout the stations.
모든 환경 요소의 접근 가능성을
And you also mentioned that for Amtrak,
135개 정도의 10년에 걸쳐
they had the mandate to fix 135 stations within the 10 years. And the vendors and the contractors, the fact that they are also included in the process to make sure that accessibility is guaranteed. These were some of the items that caught my eye. So it was a specific example of accessibility. So Mr. John Wadach talked about how accessibility can be promoted based on a piece of act from the ADA, and it wasn't just about the federal government. It was also about the representing organizations and also the persons with disabilities to be in this together, to be on the table together, that we all need all of the pieces of the puzzle all together to make this happen. You can see that there were a number of links that were introduced by Mr. Wadach, that there will be details provided, so please visit the website. So thank you. We've heard from the cases of the US on ADA and also on some of the examples that were based on ADA.
In the case of Korea, well, there may be some connection between the situation in Korea right now, which is similar to what happened in the US 20 years ago, as was explained by Professor Frieden. But when we look at the overseas examples, yes, I think one question that we could have in mind is how powerful is or influential is the ADA? If you look at the accessibility of transportation for the disabled, the related laws or regulations in Korea, we were able to develop that just in 2005. So listening to the overseas examples, the US examples, it seems that what would be the activism, what kinds of activities would allow such the establishment of such a powerful law or legal system in a country? So we have one Korean speaker who will be speaking about the mobility rights for the disabled here in Korea. Though he is a researcher on this topic, and if you look at his paper, you will see that there's a lot of overlap with the situation in the US, as was explained by the US speakers. Also, the research includes the legal aspects and the implementation efforts on the accessibility and right to mobility in Europe and many other parts of the world as well. And the speaker is Jae-won-byun, Director of Policy at the Solidarity Against Disability Discrimination. So your presentation, please. Good afternoon. I am the Director of Policy at the Solidarity Against Disability Discrimination. My name is Jae-won-byun.
Very glad to see you and happy to share my idea in PyeongChang Disability Forum. In this session, I'm going to talk about public transportation policy when it comes to the concept of mobility rights, which is similar with accessibility in general, but more original context include in South Korea historical context. For now, I will compare the policy in 3 different countries, in South Korea and in the UK and the States. Okay, I'm Jae-won-byun, an activist and a director of policy in Solidarity Against Disability Discrimination. So let's deep dive into it. 네, 그럼 지금부터 장애인 이동권 증진 방안에 대한
So I will now go into my presentation on the research that we conducted on the transportation policy for the disabled mobility rights.
많은 분들께서 좀
First of all, there seems to be some confusion with the concepts. The international standards is accessibility. So in my English introduction, I talked about accessibility, but in Korea, the exact terminology may be a bit different. In Korea, the rights to mobility terminology is being used more than accessibility. And when we had the Oido station accident, in the subway station, the disabled person had fallen. There was an accident. And so in Korea, it seems that the right to mobility is a more basic right that the disabled have been demanding for a long time. So for a long time, we had to begin from conceptualization of the right to mobility more than accessibility more broadly. So we have a definition of the right to mobility as defined by the disabled, our organization, the Solidarity Against Disability Discrimination. So here, securing the transit route from point A to point B being the destination, and the rights related to this process. That is what we mean by right to mobility. So for your information, this data was something that I had presented at the National Assembly based on my research. And so the core essence of the right to mobility is securing the the routes, the transit routes, and that is the status quo. And then lastly, there is the legal foundation, the legal basis. So the bus and the special modes, looking at the current operation and its legal foundation. That is the essence of my research. So let's look at the low floor buses first. And in the earlier presentations, I also was very impressed. The low floor buses in the US also, obviously they did not appear overnight. It's a result of decades of the advocacy work by the disabled and the disabled NGOs. And in 1990, President Bush signed the ADA in the US. And with the enactment of the ADA, if you look at Articles 2 and 3, there are stipulations about measures on movement. So Article 2 is on public service, and in Article 3, the use of the private sector in providing this public service. Firstly, one other thing that I looked at was the UK example. In the case of UK, they have what's called the DDA. This is the Disability Discrimination Act. And in 1995, it was enacted, and the guarantee to public service vehicles was stipulated, and this act was eventually included under the equality law of the UK. So in the equality law, it includes discrimination against the disabled and the accessibility or right to mobility issue. What's notable in the case of the UK is that in the US, the low-floor buses is mandatory, but then in the UK, they have a different mechanism. In the UK, to do a transportation business, you have to provide these kinds of, you have to receive accessibility certification. In the US, it was just mandatory. It was just a must. But then in the UK, you had to choose. I mean, you had the right to choose. You needed to receive accessibility certificate if you wanted to be in the public transit business. And so they introduced the PSVAR, Public Service Vehicle Accessibility Regulations, from 2000 December. So for us to look up the proportion of the low-floor buses in the US, it was meaningless because all of their buses are low-floor anyway. In the case of Korea, in the case of the Chungnam area, we just have 9.8%, Seoul area about 52%. But then in the case of the US, this percentage doesn't mean anything because it's mandatory by law. All of their buses are low-floor buses. But in the case of the UK, there are some numbers that will be relevant for us because they have a certification system. So I'd like to share with you some impressive parts from the UK system. In 2004, if you look at the topmost part, there were 28 accessibility certified buses, but then by the 2000s, it reached 98%. Within a decade, there was an increase of 70%, so they were able to reach almost 100%. Ministry of Transport in Korea and many other government officials, when we meet them, they always say it takes too much time, we can't speed it up, it takes too much money. But then in the case of the UK, I think they were quite progressive. In just 10 years, suddenly they reached 98, 99% of low-floor buses. And so this was so interesting to me. So I looked at the different regions in the UK. It's the same for the different regions as well. So it's not just in London that they had this achievement. Scotland, Wales, they all reached 98, 99%, almost 100% of low-floor buses. In the case of Korea, as I mentioned earlier, Chungnam area is just 9.8% of low-floor buses ratio. So there's a huge regional discrepancy. In the case of UK, nationally they have almost all low-floor buses, and that happened just within 10 years. So there was enormous qualitative growth, and that's the strong takeaway insight that we can derive from the example of the UK. So this issue of low-floor buses in Korea, I mean, I don't think we can continue to drag this on for too long. In Korea right now, we have the Act to promote the mobility convenience for vulnerable groups in transportation, under which we are having an increase in the number of low-floor buses. So we're talking, it includes the mandatory proportion or plans. So you will see the plans here in 2020. You will see that we have a shortage of about 4,700 low-floor buses here in Korea. So to fulfill or to reach the target set by the government, we need an additional almost 5,000 units more. And this is according to plan of the government. Obviously, we won't be able to reach this goal by the end of this year. Why do they still have this plan? So I looked at this plan for mobility improvement for the transportation vulnerable. They just reached a target on the first year only, but then for the past 15 years, the government has never reached its target. So it has not been keeping its promise. Now let's go on to the special transportation modes. In the US, they have what is called, under the ADA, that is what is called paratransit. They have followed a different logic from Korea. In the case of Korea, the disabled call taxis or for-hire taxis is often used, but in the US, it is used only as complementary means. So you can use the paratransit only in areas where there are no fixed routes of the buses. So to give you an example, my name is Taewon. If I were to run my business, Taewon Transportation Company, if we have routes and in the areas outside of my existing routes, I can utilize the paratransit system or special transportation modes. So what's clear here is that there is very strict regulations, rules on this complementary transportation modes. And I looked up this news, and if ever there's a report on these paratransit companies not meeting their promises or failing to meet their promises, they will be reported on the news, and the CEO of this company will have to make a public apology to the passenger, because this is such a big deal. But in the case of Korea, it's still a long way before we can expect such a thing. In the case of the UK, they have the community transportations. So in the US, they're called paratransit, but in the UK, they have what's called community transportation agencies, and usually it's the philanthropy groups and the local NGOs that run the Community Transport Associations, the CTA. And there's a dial or ride system which also receives the London City support. And you will see on the bottom a very interesting example. The taxi card is provided to the disabled. So all of the disabled have access to use taxis. So because sometimes special transportation modes will not be necessary because they can use the taxi anytime when needed. In the case of Korea or in the US, there is a separate regulation on the special transportation modes. But in the case of the UK, they have a taxi accessibility regulation. So these are photos of examples from the UK. So you will see that these are forms of community transport run by the local groups. This is a taxi card, and these are the black cabs. If you watch films, UK films, you will see all of the taxis in London look alike. So the gentlemen all ride the same taxis. And to tell you a side story, in the UK, the taxis are not allowed to use navigation systems, so it's very difficult to secure a license. It's a professional job. You have to know all of the roads in London. And so these taxis are all wheelchair accessible. So I will show you some photos. So all of the taxis are designed this way to be wheelchair accessible. You will see taxi 2-4, and there's Vito ramps. Also, these are the different types of the taxis. In the case of Korea, well, we have different models of cars. So it would be difficult for us to imagine taxis with wheelchair accessibility. But anyhow, in the case of UK, the taxi models are already set from the beginning. Taxi car models are designated. So the disabled using taxi cards can use these taxis to move around anywhere in the city. So now let's go to the situation in Korea. With regards to the special transportation mode operation in Korea, we've had 3 changes. In 2006, when we were enacting the law, and we had a revision in 2010. In 2010, so classification class 1, 2, disability classes, it will be 1 transportation mode or 1 unit for 200 people. And after revision, 1 unit for every 150 people. So there are regions that have reached 100% target, but you will see that most of them have not reached their goal. So basically, it's the same thing. The government has not kept its promise. That's the basic conclusion. Because it's not a target that we set, but it's something that the government set for themselves, and they failed to reach it. Now this talks about the improvements that we need in the future. To guarantee the right to mobility of the disabled people, we need to strengthen the Act on mobility convenience for the vulnerable groups. Secondly, we need to do away with all discrimination, regional discrimination with regards to the right to mobility, because some regions, they have good matching, good services, while others don't. Particularly for the capital metropolitan area, the situation is good, but then in most other regions, other cities, they have a very poor systems. And also, we have to have clear classification for the wheelchair loading for the public transportation modes. So I can ride, call taxis for the disabled, but then the problem is that it's not just the disabled that use these voucher taxis, it's all other vulnerable groups. So for example, the disabled who do not need a wheelchair taxis, maybe they should be provided with other forms of other modes of transportation and not necessarily a wheelchair taxi. And we are seeing a decline in the number of low floor buses. And because after 10 years of running the low floor buses, it seems that many of the public transportation companies are opting to go back to the staired buses. So I think the government needs to step in to give incentives to introduce more low floor buses. And so all of these measures have to be taken into consideration soon, because Korea is experiencing very quick aging right now, and we have many different vulnerable groups, the seniors, the women, the children, as well as the disabled. So we need to secure enough funding to implement these measures. Thank you very much for your attention. So from the Korean side, we had Director Jae-won Pyun from Solidarity Against Disability Discrimination just give a presentation. And we have 3 presenters in our parallel session. And so we seem to have discussed a lot of things. We are talking about buses and special transportation modes. That's one. And then we also looked into the ADA of the US. And in this presentation by Mr. Pyun, there was also a mention of the UK example and the discrimination issue that Korea still faces. So in terms of securing the routes or the removing the hindrances, I think those were very specifically explained by Mr. Byun. And also if the American system is more mandatory based, the UK example would be more of a voluntary, but then something that was very effective, so that in just 10 years there was great improvement. So within just a decade, the low floor buses rate reached almost 100% in the case of UK. With regards to the situation in Korea, looking at the numbers that come out from Korea, the reality is that we are still very backwards. We are still in the year 2000, it seems. Because every year, the Ministry of Transportation makes announcements, has plans established on increasing right to mobility of the disabled, but then oftentimes they are not met. And so He also briefly talked about the future tasks, area for improvements. Among the 5 tasks, it seems that he was very clear that we need to work on all 5. And obviously, we have excellent plans, we have good ideas, but then if we don't implement them based on strengthening the basic rights, including right to mobility of the disabled people, I mean, these government policies alone will not be very effective. As we saw from the statistics, the regional discrepancy is quite huge. And the survey results, the study results tell us that the operators, do they represent sufficient publicness? I think that's still a problem. There's so many issues and problems that continue to arise, and so we need to urgently come up with countermeasures to improve the situation. If we had more time, I think we could have looked at the global trends and the situation in Korea in closer detail from the disability group's perspective, and also what kinds of discussions and agenda we should be having in our conversations with the government. But anyhow, we had 3 excellent presentations so far.
I believe we are on time, and I guess we can now move on to the panelists. We have the Joint Representative of Solidarity Against Disability Discrimination Sejong Branch, Moon Kyung-hee. She has a very long title. So I would like to hear from you your comments. And I believe that she will particularly focus on the special means of transportation that was mentioned by Director Byun. So please, would you like to introduce yourself and begin the presentation? Hello, everyone. It is a great pleasure to be a part of this very meaningful event. So I'm very happy to join you. And let me give you a presentation on the mobility situation at Sejong City. In the case of Sejong, as you are very well aware, we have the central government, the various ministries located in Sejong. And not only that, there are also plans that maybe we might have the National Assembly also be housed in Sejong City. The population of Sejong city is 36,000, and it is a self-governing city, and it's designated as a single administrative area. And in this city, we have special means of transportation, but there are only 17 kinds of such mode of transport. It's been more than 10 years since the introduction of such special means of transportation. But you can see that there is more room for improvement. Many organizations try to find a way to improve the situation. But if you compare Sejong and Daejeon, the situation is quite different. Both cities had 10 years, but the result is in stark contrast. You can see that in Daejeon, 180 buses have wheelchair lifts. However, Sejong, only 17. In Sejong, only 17 is equipped with such lifts. But Sejong City is saying that they already met the legal requirements. In order to utilize these services, you need to make reservations. So 2 days prior at 8, you have to make reservations. We really need these mode of transport to go to school and to go to work. However, you need to make reservations. But there are persons with severe disabilities, and the number amounts to 4,500, and they need to use these facilities. We also have the elderly aged 65 and above. And in addition, we also have those with temporary disabilities that possess the statement from the doctors on the diagnosis. But Sejong City's ordinance indicates that the special means of transportation should be shared by all of these groups. So you can see that thousands of people are trying to utilize this transportation service. And we also talked about low-floor buses. And you've mentioned that the percentage in Korea being 9.8. But if you look at Sejong, only 6 routes out of 59 are accessible for the disabled. So you can see that it is very challenging for us to take advantage of the transportation that is provided by the city. And it's been more than 87 days since we embarked on the protest in front of Sejong City office for our right to mobility. We are joined by 8 civic society groups, as well as solidarity against disability discrimination. These 8 organizations came together to engage in a joint effort. We are in collaboration, and as mentioned, we are currently engaging in demonstrations in front of the city office building. And I have a video, so rather than me elaborating, I think it would be better to show you this video.
세종시에서 장애인을 대상으로 한 콜택시 서비스, 즉 누리콜이
Call, which is a call service for a call taxi service, was offered. However, discrimination, lack of quality issues have been raised, and that this should be now a public service offer rather than it being private. Moon Kyung-hee lives in Sejong, and she usually uses Nurikor, the call taxi service. She has cerebral palsy. However, there aren't that many taxis, and in the morning time, it's very difficult because it's very competitive to grab a cab. It's very difficult to grab a taxi in the morning. There are 23 drivers with 17 taxis, and it is currently run by the Intellectual Disability Organization. There are more than 4,500 persons with disabilities in Sejong, and it's true that mobility is greatly restricted. If we think about the mobility disadvantaged persons, it cannot cater to the demand of this population. There are also sexual harassment allegations, and there's a lot of criticism on the operation. Especially Ulsan and Sejong are the only ones that are running this privately out of the 8 metropolitan cities. So there is a criticism that Nurikol should now be a public service. Sejong City says that it's difficult to transfer this to the transportation unit. However, they would be engaging in stricter supervision when selecting the contractors. There are also voucher taxi channels where we want to disperse the demand for those that cannot use Nurikol. Sejong City every year is supporting 1.3 billion won to the Intellectual Disability Organization to run this Nurikol service. As you've seen in this video clip, it's very challenging to use this Nurikol service, but in addition to that, there were also sexual harassment offenses that were identified. And in addition to that, there was also a case where a driver said that he wants to go home, check out early, and did not drive the passenger to the final destination. So there were police investigations. But the organization that was running this service did not engage in any corrective measures, and that is why we started this protest, this demonstration. And as we were engaging in this protest for our right to mobility, there was, of course, fruit that we reaped in the process. One being the voucher taxis. And we were able to also see 8 units added, and the budget was also increased to 2.1 billion. However, you can see that we still cannot leave or discontinue the protest. We still continue to protest in front of the city building. Is because they are not answering our demands. So, for the users of such special means of transport, Sejong City believes that an organization that represents those with disabilities would be the best fit. However, throughout the 10 years, this organization was not doing its job. In lieu of time, I'm sorry, I would like to ask you to wrap up. Yeah, so I would like to say that we will continue on with this protest and this struggle. We believe that this newly called service, the special means of transportation, should be managed by a public agency, not a private organization. So we will continue on with this protest, and we will continue to fight for the right of mobility for persons with disabled, and we will also push for the introduction of low-floor buses for all routes. And I would like to ask for your interest and support till the very end, and your solidarity will be welcomed. Thank you. Yes, thank you very much. We are a bit behind schedule, but let me briefly summarize. You talked about the special means of transportation in Sejong City and also the current status. And the key issue here is that she is continuing to protest with the organizations to fight for a better environment for those with disabilities.
Last but not least, we do have one more panelist waiting. So please go ahead with your panel discussion, but we ask that you be brief. Good afternoon. I am Young-Sub Kim from the Gangwon Council of Centers for Independence Living Association. I am living in Wonju City, and in fact, I had prepared my PowerPoint slides for the panel discussion, but I've been given very short time, so I won't be able to give detailed information. But being invited to this disability forum itself is a great honor for me. With the 2018 PyeongChang Paralympics, the right to mobility of the disabled, there has been more interest on this topic here in Gangwon Province. And we've received attention. And the right to mobility is the beginning of all human rights of the disabled. And so this was the first disability activism that began here in Korea. In April every year in Gangwon Province, we have a disabled people's movement or activism that we do. And one important aspect of this movement is the right to mobility. So we are asking for a guarantee of the minimal rights of mobility, because that is the beginning of the guarantee of the other rights of the disabled people. And this photo is from Wonju and Gangneung, the low-floor buses there. In 2007, so it's been about 10 years now, so there were 2 low-floor buses introduced in Wonju city, so that was the beginning. Initially, we had 2 units introduced, and so at that time, now were not able to meet demand, but we began showing that the disabled can travel using the public buses through the introduction of these units. If you look at the situation of the right of mobility of the disabled in Gangwon province right now, as for the low-floor buses, with the introduction of these buses, they've actually helped to secure the right to mobility of the disabled. It also secured the foundation for independent living and expanding the social participation of the residents and of the disabled in particular. And I don't know if you can see the details, but as the low-floor buses in Gangwon province, they run it in 6 different regions. There are 18 cities and counties in Gangwon province, and it's just in 6 of these areas that the low-floor buses are being operated, which is an embarrassing result. We have 101 buses, and all of in Chuncheon, they're all concentrated in Chuncheon. Most of these buses are concentrated in the major cities of Chuncheon, Wonju, and Gangneung. In the remaining 13 cities and counties, you can't help but wonder how the disabled people there go around with such a few number of low-floor buses there. Next, I'd like to talk about the special transport modes. And what I'm talking about today, there's a lot of overlap with the presentation by Mr. Byun earlier. If you look at the 2019 special transport mode introduction plan, you will see the numbers and the current situation. If you look at the situation in Gangwon province, you will see that, well, for the city buses, the tariff rates, we have a good tariff rate system in place, and there's toll fee support given to many of the disabled people as well. But then we do have some tasks that we need to overcome because there's still a long wait time, and also transfers are very complicated and difficult. And as for the characteristics also, in Gangwon province, the area of the province has not been considered in introducing the ample number of units. So Inje and PyeongChang will be the bigger counties in Gangwon province. So the area and the distance, travel distance, should also be considered in deciding the number of units to be introduced, and not just the population. And these figures actually have been explained by Mr. Byun a bit earlier. In Gangwon province, you will see that, yes, we have special transport modes introduced throughout the province. And following the revision to the Act on Mobility Improvement for the Disabled, you will see that we have annual targets set. We have about 100,000 disabled people in Gangwon province. For the severely disabled, about 38,000. For the moderate, about 62,000. And we have just 131 units. The statutory requirement is 188. However, we only have 130 special transport modes. So indeed, this requires improvement in the future. Then what will be the tasks going forward? First of all, we need to classify the users of the special transport modes. We have to classify the more mobile and less mobile disabled people. And secondly, as for private hire taxis, there are only 3 cities that run these taxis. For wheelchair-bound disabled people, they can use the disabled taxis. For those who are not wheelchair-bound, then they could use these kinds of special transport modes. And another issue is that we have to ensure that these special modes are operated 24 hours a day and should be allowed to have wider area travel. So right now, they have a limited amount of operation of these special modes. And Gangwon Province, as you know, is a huge city. We have hosted a Winter Olympics, and in the East Coast, we have a lot of tourists coming in, a lot of demand, which requires more special transport modes to be introduced in the future. And to ensure that Gangwon Province provides a happier life to our disabled population, these are the measures that we have to take in the future. First of all, we need to introduce more of the low-floor buses. A lot of the existing low-floor buses are going out of service because of long use. And as you heard earlier, many new ones being introduced are stair buses. So we have to ensure that there is ample accessibility to disabled people by introducing more low-floor buses. And then we need to operate mid-sized, low-floor town buses as well. In fact, this was a request that we made to the Gangwon Provincial Office during the Paralympic Games. And so at that time, some low-floor town buses, well, we made that request, but that appeal has not been implemented yet as of now. And so we're really looking forward to that being implemented in the future. And we also need to introduce more expressway, intercity, low-floor buses. It's only in 4 areas where these buses are being run as demonstration projects. And so looking at what's happening with the pilot projects, the Ministry of Transportation is saying that the usage rate is very low, so we have not decided to fully introduce these low-floor buses yet. So, and there's still a lot of inconvenience, such as having to make prior reservations for use by the disabled people. And so, we feel that we need to have introduction of these buses more. And also, we need to ensure that the operators of these special modes are public entities. Right now, there is consignment or commissioned operation by the private sector, which leads to a lot of problems. In Wonju City, where I live, it's the public entity that is operating the special modes right now, which means that there is better service provided. And I think this has to happen in other cities as well. As for establishment of wider area mobility support centers, right now, as you heard from Ms. Moon Kyung-hee earlier, well, we're seeing more transits happening, and so we definitely need to establish more of these support centers in the future. And next, we need to operate more private hire taxis. We need to expand the users, and also we need to introduce chartered lift buses. Now we have about 2 being operated. So when there's a group of disabled people needing to move around, they can use these chartered lift buses, but obviously we don't have enough units yet, so we need to expand that number. And I will conclude now with this statement. Gangwon Province today is still a pristine area. So, and which means that there's a lot of room for improvement. So we need to have more consideration for the citizens, for the disabled people, and to guarantee the rights of the disabled people by guaranteeing them the right to work. And that means that we need to secure the right to mobility of the disabled. And with that, I will conclude my presentation. Thank you very much. Yes. I think our session time is already up, but we have received some questions already. Questions for Mr. John Wodach.
So in Korea, we have a non-discrimination act that's similar to ADA, and currently the Ministry of Health and Labor, the Health and Welfare is currently in charge, but I know that in the US, the Department of Justice is in charge of the ADA, and I would like to understand, is there a reason why the Department of Justice is in charge of ADA? Can you answer this question in 1 minute? I'm very sorry for that.
No. Yes, I can. The Department of Justice is in charge of the enforcement of the law, but the Department of Transportation also has responsibility. So there's dual, and the Department of Transportation is in charge of providing funding for buses and doing some of the enforcement and inspecting buses, doing that kind of issue. So it's not just the Department of Justice. The Department of Transportation also has responsibilities.
네, 감사합니다.
For your response. And there is also another question. Recently, we are looking into eco-friendly transport modes, and in Korea, we have, in the previous policies, LPG mode of transport was quite effective and helpful, but due to COVID-19, we're seeing electric vehicles or hydrogen vehicles that are mentioned as an alternative. So I would like to understand, is there any plans in the US, maybe in the trends, any plans to introduce any eco-friendly vehicles or EVs? Yes, that's a very good question, and it's a very comprehensive question, so let me try to answer that question.
We've heard about ESG recently, environment, social, and governance. So ESG has become very popular. Environment, is the core essence of ESG. In the past, we thought that it's good if you can meet the environmental requirements, but then now ESG has become the foundation of all of the policies being developed also. So eco-friendly. We are hearing about that more often right now. Previously, it was just the NGOs that talked about it, but now it's the government themselves focusing on ESG and eco-friendliness. And one hope that we can have for the future is that, first of all, we have more introduction of more eco-friendly buses. And when these eco-friendly buses are being introduced, we have to ensure that they are low-floor buses. So for the town buses also, through using this transition to eco-friendly buses, then we can naturally transition to eco-friendly low-floor buses, whether it's the public buses or the town buses. So we can use this opportunity. We have about 2 minutes remaining to our session. As a moderator, I'm feeling this great pressure, time pressure. But it seems that we don't have much leeway right now. We will have to end. But first of all, I'd like to thank Mr. John Wodach from the US, from Connecticut. And so we will have to conclude here. As for the Korean participants also, thank you, Mr. Jae-won Pyun, Ms. Moon Kyung-hee from Solidarity Against Disability Discrimination, Sejong Branch, and also Mr. Kim Young-sup from Gangwon Council. Thank you very much for being here with us today. And so with this, we will conclude parallel session 3 on Make the Right Real, Right to Move. It is time to make it. So thank you so much.